when we talk about war in a course on world politics, we're typically talking about what we call international war, or more technically, interstate war, war between states. But we want to take a few minutes now and focus on civil wars as well. Why focus on civil wars in a course on international politics? Well, there are a couple of reasons for doing that. One is that over the last 70 years or so, since the end of World War II, most of the killing that's been done has been in civil wars, not in interstate wars or international wars. And you see this. What this basically shows is the dark blue are what are called extra-state wars, which we don't really worry too much about non-state actors. Those are basically the colonial wars that came during decolonization. But interstate wars, since 1945, there have been actually very few of them, and they're getting less and less costly in terms of human lives. Well, at the same time, intrastate wars, or what we would call civil wars, this light blue area, are getting more common and much, much, much more deadly. And so the tan column are basically civil wars that become international wars. So the one basic reason to focus on civil war is it's becoming a much, much bigger deal than before. And so if we're really concerned about organized violence on a large scale, civil war is really now most of it where most of it's happening. But it's also the case that the civil war, international war distinction it really matters more in theory than in practice. There's a lot of connection between what we think of as civil wars and what we think of as international wars. And I should be clear, for civil wars, I will also use the term intrastate, within a state, and for international wars, we also will use the term interstate, between states. But many, many international wars start off as civil wars in one way or another. Oftentimes it's because there's a civil war and states intervene to support one side or the other. Oftentimes, civil war in one country creates security fears in another country that prompts them to intervene. And in some respect, right, it was domestic disturbances within the Austro-Hungarian Empire that really provided some of the impetus towards World War I, for example. But it's also the case that many international wars that start as international end up with a domestic dimension. So in the case of World War I, World War I ends up with a revolution and a civil war in Russia. And it's really a civil war in Russia that pulls Russia out of that war and leads to Russia's collapse as a fighter in that conflict. But just to get to some very recent episodes where domestic conflict has become a justification for external intervention, so that we debate over, is this a civil war? Is this an international war? In many cases, it's both. Ukraine, Syria, Libya. These are what sort of started out, we think, as domestic conflicts, but ended up pulling in lots of other actors who then, in one way or another, were fighting each other. So are they comparable? Right? If we want to explain wars, does it make sense to talk about interstate and civil wars at the same time? So this slide just kind of points to some of the differences and similarities. The key differences, it seems to me, are that when we talk about international wars, interstate wars, we're talking about wars that are between like actors, right? It's state against state. And so in that sense, there's a certain symmetry. Whereas civil wars usually are not symmetric in that they're states versus some kinds of non-state actors, right? A separatist movement or a movement that wants to change the form of government or an anti-colonial movement, something like that. But there are some real important similarities too, which is both basically involved armed groups in conflict with one another because they've decided that it makes more sense to try to fight each other to get what they want rather than not fight, or that fighting will be a useful way to shift bargaining in their favor. It's also worth pointing out that when secessionist movements succeed, intrastate wars can become interstate wars. So, for example, there was a civil war in Sudan South Sudan eventually split off, and then Sudan was fighting South Sudan. So in some respects, they're simply different points in time in a process of secession. And it's also the case that we often address them in very similar ways. We have negotiations, and sometimes we use peacekeepers to try to keep a ceasefire in place. Now, a deeper question is whether they have the same causes. So there are some explanations for intrastate or civil wars that we don't usually apply to interstate wars. A lot of the literature on civil wars looks at things like ethnic pluralism, at economic inequality within a state, at natural resources, and oftentimes civil wars seem to be about who's going to control oil wells or diamond mines or something like that, about state strength, about the ability of a government to simply have enough armed force itself to resist various kinds of rebel groups. And essentially what a lot of this literature boils down to is what is often called the greed versus grievance debate. Essentially are these civil wars about greed? That is, are they fighting over who's going to control economic resources and over inequality, or are they grievances of some type, often rooted into some kind of ethnic pluralism, and which often goes with economic inequality. So those are the kind of debates that we're having, and it's not exactly the same conversation we tend to have about international wars. And there are some, explanations for interstate wars that we don't usually apply to civil wars. Balance of power theory, the basic realist explanation, or power transition, hegemonic stability theory, another realist explanation. Nor do we usually look at the psychology of individual leaders in civil wars the way that we look at, someone like Hitler in explaining international wars. Although in some cases we do. Think about, someone like Idi Amin in Uganda, who just started a conflict because he was so horrible that finally people said we've got to do something about it. But there are a lot of common explanations for intra and interstate wars, and there's an effort really now to think about these things as maybe not being as different as we think. So one important advance in research over the last 20 or 30 years or so is the idea that the security dilemma actually applies domestically as well as internationally. And in particular, that once you have some kind of civil war, the actors in a civil war often really encounter a security dilemma in trying to think about ending the civil war. Because as you try to end the civil war, there's this great fear, right, that if your group disarms or gives up territory or does whatever's necessary, you might be vulnerable to attack in the future. So the security dilemma seems to occur in both cases, as well as some of the key elements of rationalist explanations. Individual goods, information, asymmetry, and commitment problems. And again, I'd really stress commitment problems. That when you're trying to resolve a civil war, both sides have to make promises about what they're going to do in the future, right? And in particular, it's often required that rebel groups, as part of a resolution of a civil war, that a rebel group gives up its weapons. And the problem with that is once you give up your weapons, you can't easily get them back. And so the commitment for the state to do what it says it's going to do once a rebel group is disarmed is a really tricky one. But the bigger point is there's a lot of research now that says that theoretically it makes sense to treat these wars as essentially as similar kinds of phenomena. For the purposes of this class, we don't have to work all that out. We're not going to go, conduct big researches on wars. But what I do really want us to focus on is that the distinction between international wars and civil wars is often a very, very fuzzy one, and that while in some cases they seem to be very different from one another, in many cases, international wars and civil wars seem to have some of the same dynamics. So the question is, can we learn some general ideas or some practices that might work in both kinds of situations? We'll talk more about that in the next couple of videos.